Okay, today we are reading Bloom and we are starting off at page 66 where it says he trailed off. So, he trailed off, but he was right. Anaya remembered watching the news with her parents, and the weather guy had mentioned it. How unusual it was. She watched her father's face. She could tell he was thinking hard. It looked like he was going to speak, but one of the counselors bent over her mic and said, I think we can discuss these very interesting theories after the meeting, but we have some other important business to address. We need volunteer crews to keep the grass under control. I can't believe, Teresa whispered to Fleetwood, her face still flushed. You actually think someone made it rain all over the world? Hey, I'm not the only one on the internet. Fleetwood, we've talked about this. Everything is on the internet. We can control the weather now. Oh boy. Teresa looked at Anaya, shaking her head. Anaya smiled back weakly, but she couldn't dismiss it. Dad didn't. She could tell by the serious look on his face. The Chinese have this whole government department in charge of the weather, Fleetwood was saying. They can make it rain. So you think it was the Chinese? Teresa said. I just said maybe it's possible, theoretically, to make it rain all over the planet at once. Okay, said Teresa. So how did they deliver all the seeds? 1 million airplanes? Fleetwood looked deflated. Yeah, I guess we'd have seen the planes on our radar and stuff. Cloaking technology, said Teresa, slipping her hand into Fleetwood's. Fleetwood grinned and winked at Anaya. Yeah, maybe. Anaya laughed, feeling some of the anxiety leave her shoulders. It did sound pretty far-fetched. Teresa kissed Fleetwood on the cheek. Maybe it's not even a country doing this. Maybe it's a secret organization called Slork or something. And an evil dude with scary glasses, said Anaya, biding his time in his underground lair with his supermodels and personal chef. And Pat Komodo Dragon, Fleetwood added, then sneezed. Teresa sneezed too and laughed. Then she sneezed again and kept sneezing. Anaya was suddenly aware of all the other people sneezing from every part of the hall. It sounded like some kind of malfunctioning engine. People held their elbows and tissue to their mouths. There was something scary about it, like everyone had suddenly lost control of their bodies. She looked at her father up front and saw him sneezing too. Inside, the light had changed somehow. Anaya tilted her face up to the open window. The air glittered with dust or something. She was pushed along with the tide of people heading for the doors. Outside, all around the sides of the parking lot, grew black grass. The very tallest stalks looked different, and it only took Anaya a second to understand why. Just yesterday, the flowers on the tall central stems were still tight black buds. Now they were wide open. To Anaya, they looked a bit like black sunflowers. The centers bristled with pale pollen. A horn honked at her. She stepped out of the way of a car trying to leave the parking lot. Windows rolled up, the driver jerking with sneezes. Anaya walked closer to the black grass, staring up at the flowers. The breeze rustled the stalks together. Maybe it was the unpleasant scraping sound or the big face-like flowers, but Anaya had never felt so keenly that the grass had an intelligence. With a faint creak, one of the flowers tilted its head skyward. The long black stem arched and swelled. The flower trembled and then snapped forward. With a loud pop that made Anaya jolt, 1,000 tiny grains of pollen exploded through the air. A second pop made her turn as more flowers released their mist of pollen. Everywhere, the flowers arched and recoiled as their pollen shot through the air like fireworks. The parking lot was chaos now, people shouting and sneezing and hurrying to their car, doors slamming, cars starting, horns blaring. Overhead, the air was heavy with pollen, the sunlight illuminating the golden grains as they danced and swirled higher in the heat of the afternoon. And Anaya thought, this is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Across the parking lot, she caught sight of Seth and Petra. They weren't sneezing at all, and neither was she. It was weird for Petra, stepping inside Anaya's house after so long, but right away she remembered the frayed mat, the homemade shoe rack, the wall-mounted coat hooks in the shape of elephant tusks, and the familiar, faintly spicy fragrance of the house itself. She used to spend so much time here, and with a pang, she realized how much she missed it. "Thanks for bringing them over," Mr. Riggs said, looking at the bottles of water she carried. "Come on into the kitchen." Her father sneezed again. On the way over, it hadn't been so bad inside the car with the windows rolled up. The pollen had swirled against the windshield, forming little drifts against the wipers. Even the short dash from the car to the Riggs's front door made her dad's eyes and nose stream. But she herself was absolutely fine. She had no idea why. Mr. Riggs said, "Cal, we've got plenty of allergy meds." Her father nodded gratefully. "Yes, please. What do you have?" When they walked into the kitchen, Anaya was already popping a pill from a blister pack. "Might I recommend 10 milligrams of cetirizine?" she said. "You certainly know your pharmaceuticals," Petra's father chuckled. "I'm kind of an expert," Anaya replied, offering him the pill with a glass of water. Petra didn't laugh. So typical of Anaya to show off how clever she was. She loved being smart. Whenever the teachers returned tests, she'd always smile and leave her paper face up on the desk so everyone could see her marks. If someone answered a question wrong in class, she'd do this little head shake and then lift her hand really high. Petra got good marks too, but she wasn't so obnoxious about it. "Do you want some antihistamines too?" Anaya asked her. "I'm good." She noticed Anaya wasn't sneezing at all, and seemed kind of smug about it. Her face also looked less pimply and puffy than usual. She could almost notice how pretty her mouth and eyes were, which irritated Petra even more. She set her bottles down on the old wooden table and saw Anaya watching closely, enviously even. Inwardly, Petra smiled. Did Anaya have any strange plant specimens? No. Had Anaya figured out the seeds must have come with the rain? No. Take that, smart girl. "So let's see what we've got here," Mr. Riggs said, bending close to the bottles. "The growth all happened overnight?" "Yes." "Okay, I'm just going to dump out the water," Mr. Riggs said, taking one of the bottles to the sink with a colander, where a colander was waiting. "Oh," said Petra, "do you mind saving it? It's just—" She snuck a glance at Anaya, who raised a curious eyebrow. Petra didn't care what she thought. She still wanted the water to wash with, even if weird stuff had grown in it. She couldn't bear the idea of losing it. "Right, sure," said Mr. Riggs. He put a big pot under the colander and drained the first bottle. He brought the colander back to the table, lifting out the 2 black stalks, and placed them on a plastic cutting board. Everyone crowded around. "Okay, this is definitely the same grass we've got everywhere. What's impressive is the seeds germinated in water and didn't rot. These dudes are very adaptable." "They don't look very healthy, though," Petra said. "In the ground, the stuff grows 4 feet overnight." "True," said Mr. Riggs. Mr. Riggs said, "He definitely prefers a terrestrial home. Okay, next." He drained the second bottle. Inside was the plant with the bat-shaped leaves, which were plastered against the bottle's sides. "You want a pair of chopsticks?" Anaya said. "Good idea," her father said. "I don't want to tear them." Using the chopsticks, Mr. Riggs delicately gripped the plant and eased it out through the neck. Seeing it spread flat on the cutting board, Petra was surprised at how big the leaves were. All this just overnight, in the darkness of the medicine cabinet? She looked at their fine black veins, the tiny hairs. "The leaves are quite fleshy," Mr. Riggs said, handling them gently. "Perfectly symmetrical. And see," he touched a small bulge in the plant center. "I think there might be a flowering stem beginning here. It reminds me of a water lily." "Same black color as the grass, Petra said. "You think they're related, Mr. Riggs?" "Possibly. Let's have a look at this last one." At the sink, he poured out the third bottle and returned with the colander. Resting on the bottom were the 3 tiny black peas. Petra frowned. The tiny shoots looked longer than they had inside the bottle. "These guys," Mr. Riggs remarks, "look a bit like very tiny bulbs." "Does that mean they're flowers?" Petra asked. "Could be. A flower bulb has multiple roots at the bottom, though. These guys just have a single shoot growing from this bud here, right at the pointy end." He picked up one of the bulbs. "They're very young. These shoots are still undifferentiated." Undifferentiated? She asked, and was sorry she did because Anaya answered, they haven't started forming leaves or branching off yet. Petra caught Mr. Riggs give his daughter an approving look and tried not to roll her eyes. Her own dad asked, have you seen anything like this, Mike? No, and it's hard to know what this one's going to become. As he held it close to his face, Petra saw a bead of fluid leak from the bulb onto the pad of his thumb. Huh? Mr. Riggs said, setting down the bulb and sniffing the liquid. He rubbed it between his fingertips and then frowned. Abruptly, he stood up and hurried to the sink. Dad? Anaya said hurriedly. Mr. Riggs turned on the tap and held his hand under the water. That has a nasty sting to it, he said over his shoulder. Don't touch it. Let's take a look, Petra's dad said. When Mr. Riggs turned, Petra could see the angry blisters on his fingertips. Hard to tell if it's an allergic reaction or an acid burn, her dad said. She looked back down at the bulb and gave a cry as its shoot twitched. Holy crap, it just moved! I saw it too, Anaya said. Their eyes met, and just for a second, it was like they were friends again. You sure, Petra? Her dad asked. Yeah, it was like it just grew. Does it look a little longer to you guys? She didn't know much about plants, but they weren't supposed to be able to see them growing. Anaya, Mr. Riggs said, could you get some Ziploc bags and wet paper towels to pack these things up? Put on gloves before handling the bulbs. Sure thing. Thanks for bringing these, Petra, Mr. Riggs said. This is incredibly useful. He pointed to the bulbs and the bat-leafed plants. I haven't seen reports of these varieties. He shook his head. 3 new plant species in 1 sample of rainwater. Seems like quite a coincidence, doesn't it? So you think it's possible, she asked him? The seeds were actually in the rain? Hard to dismiss, Mr. Riggs said. Petra cut a sideways glance at Anaya. She couldn't help gloating. Maybe she was the first person to come up with the idea. The first person who wasn't crazy anyway. So hang on, said her father. If the seeds were all delivered together, it means someone's doing this, right? Bioterrorism? Mr. Riggs nodded gravely. I'll be calling the ministry. Petra watched Anaya packing the plants into Ziploc bags. Is it safe for me to keep washing with the water? Because of the seeds, I mean? Mr. Riggs considered her question. Well, it hasn't hurt you so far, but probably best not to. He held up his red fingertips. You don't want anything like this getting on your skin or eyes. Okay, she nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. So what happens next? I'll transport these seedlings at the farm, Mr. Riggs said, and grow them in controlled conditions. We need to know what else we're facing.